We bring you a lot of mega projects on this channel, and the ones we present have an especially wide range of results. Some have gone down in history as technological marvels, breaking barriers in engineering and design. Others are remembered as embarrassments, either due to failures of execution or sometimes because they were beyond stupid from the start. Still others have a legacy that's yet to be written, either because they've not yet been built or because they've just not yet been opened. But if there's one category of mega projects that seems almost guaranteed to bring stories of dumbass visions and bungled outcomes, it's the planned city, a veritable LMFAO of the engineering world. From well-intentioned but completely unnecessary projects like South Africa's Modderfontein New City and France's Europa City, to grand money-making ventures like Hollywoodland, Ohio, to sprawling vanity projects like Saudi Arabia's Neom or Dubai's artificial archipelago The Universe, a planned city is almost always just an excuse to throw some money into a giant pit and then set it on fire. Even those rare ones that do get finished often go empty or nearly uninhabited because, frankly, they typically weren't needed in the first place. At this point, we know our history well enough to know that if a country or a company is proposing to build a planned city, well, that's code for, we're not going to successfully build a planned city. But like any rule in this world, our rule on planned cities has its exceptions, and perhaps none stand out quite like the city of Abuja. Planned by the country of Nigeria in the 1970s as a new capital city, Abuja has not only been built, but get this, people actually live there. In today's video, we're going to dig into the city's conception, its construction, and the reasons why this planned city worked, where the vast majority of attempts thus far have failed. The now former capital city of Nigeria, Lagos, is a booming economic and cultural hub, referred to by many even today as the informal capital city of all of Africa. It's a megacity with an estimated current population of about 24 million people, and it's one of the fastest growing cities in the last half century compared to its population of 1.5 million back in just 1970. But Lagos also has a whole lot of problems, and it's had many of those problems for decades. Wealth inequality within Nigeria exists on a massive scale, with one of the highest birth rates in the world and a massive, constant influx of refugees from neighboring nations, many of whom have suffered conflict after conflict throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Much of the city's population does not maintain permanent residence anywhere in the city. Its streets and settlements are badly crowded. Many parts of the city lack any basic sanitation and access to clean water, and many of its slums, including the Makoko floating community built on wooden stilts, are surrounded by wastewater and threatened by rising sea levels. For a wealthy Nigerian or an international tourist, Lagos has historically been the place to be in Africa, but everybody else who lives there, they're in a situation that looks to be going from decades on decades of bad to worse. And as is the case with any large-scale development initiative in sub-Saharan Africa, it is impossible to discuss the building of Abuja without at least touching on the highly relevant legacy of colonialism and exploitation that put the region where it is today. This is just as true in Lagos as it is anywhere else, and in fact, the city only exists where it is, on a patchwork of land that's hard to build on, harder to organize development on, and damn near impossible to even get an accurate headcount of its inhabitants, because it made sense as a port city to funnel raw goods toward Europe prior to Nigerian independence. Lagos is a bad location to have a capital city, not just because of the gridlock and the stinking slums that many Nigerian elite fear would cast their nation in a bad light, but because those problems have been getting worse, not better, ever since Nigeria gained independence in 1960. Not only that, but Lagos had a difficult time reaching outward to its faraway provinces. And finally, it's important to recognize the ethnic divides within Nigeria itself. At the time that a new capital city was first discussed, Lagos was predominantly inhabited by Nigeria's Yoruba population, which made both a bad look and an uphill battle for the country's many other tribal and ethnic populations trying to gain a foothold in the government. The solution, according to the federal government of Nigeria, would have to come in the form of a new capital city. In sharp contrast to the planned city proposals of recent years, Nigeria actually identified its need for a new capital all the way back in 1976, 16 years after Brazil's planned new capital city, Brasilia, had successfully opened. In Nigeria, the Committee on the Location of the Federal Capital established a list of criteria for their new site. It would have to be central, located in a climate conducive to human comfort and vigor, include plenty of extra space, an adequate water supply and power resources, acceptable security, accessible transport, easily drained, agreeable to most of Nigeria's ethnic groups, and located near building materials. Authorities settled on the location of what is now Abuja for several reasons. It's relatively central within Nigeria, it's easily accessible, it was at the time surrounded by open land for future expansion, and it features a far cooler and less humid climate than Lagos while being out of the reach of rising sea levels. The area is dominated by a couple of monoliths, some really big rocks, and an ecologically vibrant watershed. It's also situated on land that isn't claimed by any of Nigeria's major ethnic groups. The name Abuja actually belonged to a nearby town at this point, although it's since been renamed. But despite picking their location, Nigerian leaders also would have to contend with real barriers in this project, not least the enormous price tag in a country with only limited financial resources and a not insignificant problem with corruption. Nigeria at the time suffered from significant unemployment, something that new construction jobs and the potential of a new city's worth of industry would certainly alleviate, but the government would still have to take a major hit in the short term to reap those later rewards. Their solution was a simple one, a common-sense measure that planned city aficionados before and since would kick themselves in the rear for not figuring out. Abuja wouldn't be built all at once, and it would not be an artificial city that was constructed around vague estimates of a later population without thought to whether or not anyone would actually want to live there. Instead, Abuja would grow and develop naturally as needed, ensuring that Nigeria would only be building developments in the ballpark range of what would actually be filled, and it would not at any point have to justify the sort of insane expenditure needed to build a London-sized city out of nowhere. And Abuja wouldn't make an attempt to supersede Lagos as Nigeria's capital of commerce and trade. It had a different function, a different reason to exist, and both Abuja and Lagos would be focused in a way that benefited both cities if they closely collaborated. Construction would take place over 10 to 15 years, learning from the failures of rush city planning in Brasilia and elsewhere, and Nigeria would solicit strong international support in order to do so. At the time that planning and implementation work began on Abuja, Nigeria was under the control of a military government led by Generals Murtala Mohammed and Olusegun Obasanjo after the close of the Nigerian Civil War. But rather than using the project solely as a way to funnel revenues into the maw of the military regime, Abuja was to be an important part of the transition back to civilian leadership. Among the regime's contributions was their selection of a triumvirate of 3 American firms to lead the project, winning a global bidding process to do so. Under Nigeria's first democratically elected president, Shehu Shagari, construction began on Abuja in 1979. For the first several years, construction was slow, despite attempts from President Shagari to speed the process along, mostly due to a continued environment of political and economic instability after the war. He also attempted to kickstart development by moving the initial date of occupation from 1986 to 1982, which was perhaps not the wisest idea considering that it was already uncertain whether the capital would be ready by 1986. This muted progress made Abuja into a lightning rod for criticism in its early years, most of all from a Yoruba nationalist politician named Obafemi Awolowo, who strongly opposed the move of the capital city away from the majority Yoruba city of Lagos. Awolowo had challenged Shagari for the presidency in 1979 and made a habit of deriding the new city, vowing at one point to hire Disney to turn it into a theme park if he was made president. But by the time Shagari was elected, the master plan for Abuja was already complete, and despite those first few years of stumbling, Shagari's election was in many ways a tacit green light from the Nigerian people to go ahead with the process. But the building process in Abuja also ignored a real human cost. The land on which the city was built might have technically been ethnically neutral, sparsely populated, and ideal for a big city, but it wasn't empty. In fact, it was the ancestral land for the Gwari ethnic group, thousands of families who worked in rural agriculture who were not consulted when their land was chosen for development. Instead, they were kicked out, taken away in military trucks and brought to poor areas around the new capital that still host the area's surviving former landowners to this day. Abuja's federal capital territory sits on lands that once comprised over 800 villages, and for the cost of 1,000 naira apiece, that's the equivalent of $2, its inhabitants were taken out of those villages to a location with minimal infrastructure, no farming land, and no schools, all of which were promised by the government as reparations, but none of which were provided. These days, the Nigerian government claims that everyone removed from their land in the 1970s was cared for and consulted previously, and nobody was forced to leave. But obviously, history tells a somewhat different story. As slow construction wore on, the development process took even more hits. President Shigari's first board to design Abuja had been filled with professionals in all the right fields for the project, but when the time came to replace them, it was with political appointees who were disinterested in the process. In late 1983, dozens of developers were arrested on charges of fraud, and significant allotments of money for the project managed to find their way into the coffers of President Shigari's political party. By 1984, most of the area set aside for Abuja was still minimally developed, largely because of Shigari's decision to waste more time and money building temporary facilities so he could show off in Abuja on Nigeria's Independence Day 2 years earlier. But Shigari was no longer president in 1984, and in fact, Nigeria was no longer a republic. A coup led by Major General Muhammadu Buhari overthrew Shigari in December of 1983 and installed a military administration similar to the one of a few years previous. By the way, if the name Muhammadu Buhari sounds all too familiar, that's because Buhari is still the president of Nigeria today. Rather than get into Buhari's own convoluted political history, we're going to focus on his rationale for the takeover in 1983, though. That a civilian government, as deeply corrupt and as flawed as Shigari's, was just as bad as not having a democracy at all. Now, we'll leave the philosophical side of that debate for the comment section, but as for the allegations of corruption and general Belendish behavior by Shigari, well, yeah, fair enough. Now, look, we here at Mega Projects, we're not going to argue that rule by military junta is an altogether good time, but it does often tend to be pretty good for completing mega projects. Abuja was no different, and Buhari was in need of a good series of successes to show why he was so much better of a leader than Shigari. Within 3 years, Buhari's regime had built enough water and telecommunications infrastructure in Abuja to support 1 million people. By 1988, the regime established the University of Abuja, while the cityscape itself began to rise out of the ground. Within a couple of short years, Nigerians began flocking to the city at a pace that began to outstrip housing availability. This trend took after the same pattern of wide-scale migration that had caused Lagos to swell, but now they were headed to a city that was ready to receive them. The unexpected population boom led to the construction of new dams and hydroelectric power plants, hundreds of schools were built, and some 300 doctors moved to Abuja to support a series of hospitals. Predictably, private industry didn't miss out on the chance to make some fat stacks, and a wide range of developments started up in support. Now, we've held off on describing what the city actually looks like thus far due to the patchwork and often heavily revised plans that got Abuja to this point. But by 1990, Phase 1 of the city had taken shape, with a concentric series of inner districts that spread outward from the foot of a 400-meter-tall monolith called Aso Rock. Other phases of construction moved outward from there, each divided from each other by various expressways and highways, with the districts of Phase 5 including space for Abuja's International Airport and the University of Abuja's permanent campus. Although many of Abuja's suburbs and exurbs would be built later, the city and its nearby transportation infrastructure was designed in a way that could easily be built into bedroom communities and other non-urban developments. In this way, construction on Abuja sped along until it was ready for opening. Behind schedule, yeah, but with nowhere near the sort of decades-long delays that usually doom a city of this type. The Aso Rock presidential villa was opened in 1991 when Nigeria's military president at the time, Ibrahim Babangida, became its first official resident. As the villa became the Nigerian presidency's home base, so too was Abuja made Nigeria's seat of power. By then, the area was already well settled, and a population boom around the turn of the millennium would significantly expand the city. With more people came a level of cultural and artistic vibrancy that started to make the city feel quite a lot less sterile and a lot more lived in. From there, momentum started to take hold and began a cycle of local growth that still continues to this day. In 2022, Abuja was estimated to host a population of 1.7 million people, making it the 7th largest city in Nigeria, with a metro population of about 6 million. Between 2000 and 2010, Abuja's population grew by almost 140%, making it the world's fastest growing city in that time, and the growth hasn't stopped. If anything, that cycle of expansion within the city has only gotten more powerful. In modern Abuja, there's more than enough available resources, developers, and potential inhabitants to just toss up another city district when it's needed, often on relatively short timescales. Today, Abuja is beginning to host skyscrapers and other tall buildings that typically define a city of its size, most prominently the Millennium Tower and Cultural Center. Abuja also hosts the Nigerian Presidential Complex, the Central Bank of Nigeria, the Abuja National Stadium, the National Mosque, and the National Church, as well as a long list of other cultural, religious, and economic landmarks that are meant to consolidate power within the city. Among a range of unique local features are Abuja's informal bush bars, which, from what we can tell, have about the same sort of social function as a laid-back local brewery in the United States. Its monoliths, Zuma Rock and Aso Rock, feature prominently in the city's tourism industry, as do its lakes, gardens, and game reserves. In many ways, Abuja has filled not just its function as a new center of government, but as a picturesque, peaceful capital city fit to introduce Nigeria to the world. But it's important to note here that the city of Abuja is nowhere near perfect, even despite its many successes. As with the rest of Nigeria, wealth inequality remains painfully commonplace. The city's Wuse district features some of the highest property values in Africa, pockmarked by mansions and federal bureaus. On the opposite end, Abuja's shantytowns have grown quickly on the edge of the city, hosting many refugees who've fled the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast part of the country, as well as international refugees who have crossed the border. Urban poverty is often dismissed within Abuja as an inconvenient reality, one that can be ignored without much trouble, and neglect has led sanitation issues to pile up on the outskirts. Abuja's high cost of living makes these shantytowns difficult to escape, even as they're stuffed with the drivers, cleaners, cooks, and other personnel who make the city function. But they're also conveniently situated outside the city, unlikely to get in the way of a diplomatic tour through Abuja's business or entertainment district, so the problem goes unchecked. Making matters worse, a security task force known as the Abuja Environmental Protection Board, or AEPB, has worked to harness and often repress the urban poor, often via extortive or physically violent methods. Yet even with Abuja's systematic and pervasive inequality, even with the continued and deeply hurtful legacy of forced evictions and relocations that made the city possible, it's hard to see Abuja in aggregate as anything other than an overwhelming success. The city has taken Nigeria from a capital that was rotting at its core to one which certainly does have major problems, but nonetheless meets all the needs of the Nigerian government. And it's taken a sparsely populated land and it's turned it into a booming metropolis, one that will probably continue to grow for decades to come. So why did the planned city of Abuja actually work, when so many planned cities before and since have failed? Well, there's a wide range of answers, but they all bear repeating. Perhaps the most important was the simple fact that Abuja was a response to demand. It was built over time in order to meet the actual needs of an actual people, instead of simply existing as a geopolitical flex like some of the planned city concepts that we mentioned today. Also crucial was the fact that Nigeria was at that time and still is defined by high internal migration rates and birth rates, with a strong tendency for both rural Nigerians and immigrants from the region to flock toward major cities. That is to say, there were people who would actually want to live in Abuja. The capital also has some real tangible benefits over the one that it replaced, both in terms of its accessibility and its climate, and although it's unfortunate that things are this way, the reality is that a cleaner, safer, and less slummy alternative to Lagos appealed to Nigeria's elite. It's often not enough for a planned city to just be decent if there are other cities nearby that are equally decent. Instead, they've got to be an improvement in some way, and Abuja was just that. So even despite its complex history and despite the pervasive problems that it still has yet to truly fix, the city has managed to break the mold not just among sub-Saharan Africa's capital cities, but among attempts to build planned cities at all. As Abuja continues to swell in population, it will absolutely need to work out its kinks and find a way to keep its growth sustainable while making the city an equitable place to live for the people who are already there. But it's already beaten the odds many times, from civil wars to military juntas to internal corruption to resistance from many of Nigeria's powerful leaders, and now it has taken its place as one of the economic and cultural centers of Africa. If any city has proven that it can overcome a challenge, it's Abuja, and we, for our part, are very interested to see whether Abuja can do just that.